everyone, and welcome to the Page Turners here with Miss Beth at Pueblo West Library. So tonight we are most definitely going to finish the Phantom Tollbooth. We only have maybe like 20 pages left. And remember from last time where we left off, they had just met the census taker, and they thought they saw a circus. But it turns out that there was no circus at all. It was just really a trick of their mind from the census taker. So that's where we left off, and we're going to start right there. "There is no circus," cried Milo, realizing he'd been tricked. "There were no smells," barked Tock, his alarm now ringing furiously. "The applause is gone," complained the disappointed humbug. I warned you, I was the census taker," sneered the census taker. "I help people find what they're not looking for, hear what they're not listening for, run after what they're not chasing, and smell what isn't even there. And furthermore," he cackled, hopping around gleefully on his stubby legs, "I'll steal your sense of purpose, take your sense of duty, destroy your sense of proportion, and, but for one thing, you'd be helpless yet." "What's that?" asked Milo fearfully. "As long as you have the sound of laughter," he groaned unhappily, "I cannot take your sense of humor. And with it, you've nothing to fear from me." "But what about them?" cried the terrified bug, for at that very instant, the other demons had reached the top at last and were leaping forward to seize them. They ran for the stairs, bowling over the disconsolate census taker, ledger, ink bottle, eye shade, and all, as they went. The humbug dashed up first, then Tock, and lastly Milo, almost too late as a scaly arm brushed his shoe. The dangerous stairs danced dizzily in the wind, and the clumsy demons refused to follow. But they howled with rage and fury, swore bloody vengeance, and watched with many pairs of burning eyes as the three small shapes vanished slowly into the clouds. "Don't look down," advised Milo as the bug tottered upward on unsteady legs. Like a giant corkscrew, the stairway twisted through the darkness, steep and narrow, and with no rail to guide them. The wind howled cruelly in an effort to tear them loose, and the fog dragged clammy fingers down their backs. But up the giddy flight they went, each one helping the others, until at last the clouds parted, the darkness fell away, and a glow of golden sun rays warmed their arrival. The castle gates swung open smoothly. They entered the great hall on a rug as soft as a snowdrift, and they stood shyly waiting. "Come right in, please. We've been expecting you," sang out two sweet voices in unison. At the far end of the hall, a silver curtain parted, and two young women stepped forward. They were dressed all in white and were beautiful beyond compare. One was grave and quiet, with a look of warm understanding in her eyes, and the other seemed gay and joyful. "You must be the Princess of Pure Reason," said Milo, bowing to the first. She answered simply, "Yes," and that was just enough. "Then you are Sweet Rhyme," he said with a smile to the other. Her eyes sparkled brightly, and she answered with a laugh as friendly as the mailman's ring when you know there's a letter for you. "We've come to rescue you both," Milo explained very seriously. "And the demons are close behind," said the worried humbug, still shaky from his ordeal. "And we should leave right away," advised Tock. "Oh, they won't dare come up here," said Reason gently, "and we'll be down there soon enough." "Why not sit for a moment and rest?" suggested Rhyme. "I'm sure you must be tired. Have you been traveling long?" "Days," sighed the exhausted dog, curling up on a large downy cushion. "Weeks," corrected the bug, flopping into a deep, comfortable armchair, for it did seem that way to him. "Oh, it has been a long trip," said Milo, climbing onto the couch where the princesses sat. "But we would have been here much sooner if I hadn't made so many mistakes. I'm afraid it's all my fault." "You must never feel badly about making mistakes," explained Reason quietly, "as long as you take the trouble to learn from them. for you often learn more by being wrong for the right reasons than you do by being right for the wrong reasons. But there's so much to learn, he said with a thoughtful frown. Yes, that's true, admitted Rhyme, but it's not just learning things that's important. It's learning what to do with what you learn and learning why you learn things at all that matters. That's just what I mean, explained Milo as Talk and the exhausted bug drifted quietly off to sleep. Many of the things I'm supposed to know seem so useless that I can't see the purpose in learning them at all. There's the princesses on the couch with Milo. You may not see it now, said the Princess of Pure Reason, looking knowingly at Milo's puzzled face. But whatever we learn has a purpose, and whatever we do affects everything and everyone else, if even in the tiniest way. Why, when a housefly flaps his wings, a breeze goes round the world, and when a speck of dust falls to the ground, the entire planet weighs a little more. And when you stamp your foot, the earth moves slightly off its course. Whenever you laugh, gladness spreads like the ripples in a pond. And whenever you're sad, no one anywhere can be really happy. It's much the same thing with knowledge, for whenever you learn something new, the whole world becomes that much richer. And remember also, added the Princess of Sweet Rhyme, that many places you would like to see are just off the map, and many things you want to know are just out of sight, or a little beyond your reach. But someday you'll reach them all, for what you learn today, for no reason at all, will help you discover all the wonderful secrets of tomorrow. I think I understand, Milo said, still full of questions and thoughts. But which is the most important? At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by a far-off chopping noise. With each loud blow, the entire room and everything in it shook and rattled. Down below on the murky peak, the demons were busily cutting the stairway loose with axes and hammers and saws. Before long, the whole thing collapsed with a tremendous crash, and the startled humbug leaped to his feet just in time to see the castle drifting slowly off into space. "We're moving," he shouted, which was a fact that had already become obvious to everyone. "I think we had better leave now," said Rhyme softly, and Reason agreed with a nod. "But how will we get down?" groaned the humbug, looking at the wreckage below. "There's no stairway, and we're sailing higher every minute." "Well, time flies, doesn't it?" asked Milo. "On many occasions," barked Talk, jumping eagerly to his feet. "I'll take everyone down." "Can you carry us all?" inquired the bug. "For a short distance," said the dog thoughtfully. "The princesses can ride on my back, Milo can catch hold of my tail, and you can hang on to his ankles." "But what of the castle in the air?" the bug objected, not very pleased with the arrangement. "Let it drift away," said Rhyme. "And good riddance," added Reason, "for no matter how beautiful it seems, it's still nothing but a prison." Talk then backed up 3 steps and, with a running start, bounded through the window with all his passengers and began the long glide down. The princesses sat tall and unafraid. Milo held on as tight as he could, and the bug swung crazily like the tail in a kite. Down through the darkness they plunged to the mountains and the monsters below. Chapter 19, The Return of Rhyme and Reason. Sailing past 3 of the tallest peaks and just over the outstretched arms of the grasping demons, they reached the ground and landed with a sudden jolt. "Quick," urged Talk, "follow me, we'll have to run for it." With the princesses still on his back, he galloped down the rocky trail, and not a moment too soon, for pounding down the mountainside in a cloud of clinging dust and a chorus of chilling shrieks came all the loathsome creatures who chose to live in ignorance and who had waited so very impatiently. Thick black clouds hung heavily overhead as they fled through the darkness, and Milo, looking back for just a moment, could see the awful shapes coming closer and closer. Just to the left and not very far away were the triple demons of compromise. One tall and thin, one short and fat, and the third exactly like the other two. As always, they moved in ominous circles, for if one said here, the other said there, and the third agreed perfectly with both of them. And since they always settled their differences by doing what none of them really wanted, they rarely got anywhere at all, and neither did anyone they met. Jumping clumsily from boulder to boulder and catching hold with his cruel, curving claws was the horrible hopping Hindsight, a most unpleasant fellow whose eyes were in the rear, and whose rear was out in front. He invariably leaped before he looked and never cared where he was going as long as he knew why he shouldn't have gone to where he'd been. And most terrifying of all, directly behind, inching along like giant soft-shelled snails, with blazing eyes and wet, anxious mouths, came the Gorgons of hate and malice, leaving a trail of slime behind them and moving much more quickly than you'd think. "Faster!" shouted Tock. "They're closing in!" Down from the heights they raced, the humbug with one hand on his hat and the other flailing desperately in the air, Milo running as he had never run before, and the demons just a little bit faster than that. From off on the right, his heavy, bulbous body lurching dangerously on the spindly legs, which barely supported him, came the overbearing know-it-all, talking continuously, a dismal demon who was mostly mouth. He was ready at a moment's notice to offer misinformation on any. Often tumbled heavily. It was never he who was hurt, but rather the unfortunate person on whom he fell. Next to him, but just a little behind, came the gross exaggeration, whose grotesque features and thoroughly unpleasant manners were hideous to see, and whose rows of wicked teeth were made only to mangle the truth. They hunted together and were bad luck to anyone they caught. Riding along the back of anyone who'd carry him was the threadbare excuse, a small, pathetic figure whose clothes were worn and tattered and who mumbled the same things again and again in a low but piercing voice. "Well, I've been sick, but the page was torn out. I missed the bus, but no one else did it. Well, I've been sick, but the page was torn out. I missed the bus, but no one else did it." He looked quite harmless and friendly, but once he grabbed on, he almost never let go. Closer and closer they came, bumping and jolting each other, clawing and snorting in their eager fury. Tock staggered along bravely with rhyme and reason. Milo's lungs now felt ready to burst as he stumbled down the trail, and the humbug was slowly falling behind. Gradually, the path grew broader and more flat as it reached the bottom of the mountain and turned toward Wisdom. Ahead lay light and safety, but perhaps just a bit too far away. And down came the demons from everywhere, frenzied creatures of darkness lurching wildly toward their prey. And let me show you this illustration in the book. All the monsters that are chasing them. From off in the rear, the terrible Trivium and the wobbly gelatinous giant urged them on with glee. And pounding forward with a rush came the ugly Dilemma, snorting steam and looking intently for someone to catch on the ends of his long pointed horns, while his hoofs hit eagerly at the ground. The exhausted humbug swayed and tottered on his rubbery legs, a look of longing on his anguished face. "I don't think I can," he gasped as a jagged slash of lightning ripped open the sky and the thunder stole his words. Closer and closer the demons loomed as the desperate chase neared its end. Then, gathering themselves for one final leap, they prepared to engulf first the bug, then the boy, and lastly the dog and his two passengers. They rose as one and suddenly stopped, as if frozen in midair, unable to move, staring ahead in terror. Milo slowly raised his weary head, and there in the horizon, for as far as the eye could see, stood the massed armies of Wisdom, the sun glistening from their swords and shields, and their bright banners slapping proudly at the breeze. For a moment, everything was silent. Then 1,000 trumpets sounded, then 1,000 more. And like an ocean wave, the long line of horsemen advanced, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until with a gallop and a shout which was music to Milo's ears, they swept forward toward the horrified demons. There's the armies of wisdom coming to save the day. There in the lead was King Azaz, his dazzling armor embossed with every letter in the alphabet, and with him the mathematician brandishing a freshly sharpened staff. From his tiny wagon, Dr. Discord hurled explosion after explosion to the delight of the sound keeper, while the busy din collected them almost all at once. And in honor of the occasion, Chroma the Great led his orchestra in a staring display of patriotic colors. Everyone Milo had met during his journey had come to help. The men of the marketplace, the miners of Digitopolis, and all the good people from the valley and the forest. The spelling bee buzzed excitedly overhead, shouting, "Charge! C-H-A-R-G-E! Charge! C-H-A-R-G-E!" Canby, who, as everyone knew, was as cowardly as can be, came all the way from Conclusions to show that he was also as brave. And even Officer Shrift, mounted proudly on a long, low dachshund, galloped grimly along. Cringing with fear, the monsters of ignorance turned in flight, and with anguished cries too horrible ever to forget, returned to the damp, dark places from which they came. The humbug sighed with relief. And Milo and the princesses prepared to greet the victorious army. "Well done," stated the Duke of Definition, dismounting and grasping Milo's hand warmly. "Fine job," seconded the Minister of Meaning. "Good work," added the Count of Connotation. "Congratulations," proposed the Earl of Essence. "Cheers," recommended the Undersecretary of Understanding. And since that's exactly what everyone felt like doing, that's exactly what everyone did. "It's we who should thank," began Milo when the shouting had subsided, but before he could finish, they had unrolled an enormous scroll, and with a fanfare of trumpets and drums, they stated in order that, "Henceforth and forthwith, let it be known by all men that rhyme and reason reign once more in wisdom." The two princesses bowed gratefully and warmly kissed their brothers, and they all agreed that a very fine thing had happened. "And furthermore," continued the proclamation, "the boy named Milo, the dog known as Tock, and the insect hereinafter referred to as the Humbug, are hereby declared to be heroes of the realm." Cheer after cheer filled the air, and even the bug seemed a bit embarrassed at having so much attention paid to him. "Therefore," concluded the Duke, "in honor of their glorious deed, a royal holiday is declared. Let there be parades through every city in the land, and a gala carnival of 3 days' duration, consisting of jousts, games, feast, and follies." The 5 cabinet members then rolled up the large parchment, and with many bows and flourishes, retired. Swift horsemen carried the news to every corner of the kingdom, and as the parade slowly wound its way through the countryside, crowds of people gathered to cheer it along. Garlands of flowers hung from every house and shop and carpeted the streets. Even the air shimmered with excitement, and shutters closed for many years were thrown open to let the brilliant sunlight shine where it hadn't shone in so long. Milo, Tock, and the very subdued Humbug sat proudly in the royal carriage with Azaz, the math magician, and the 2 princesses, and the parade stretched for miles in both directions. As the cheering continued, Rhyme leaned forward and touched Milo gently on the arm. "They're shouting for you," she said with a smile. "But I could never have done it without everyone else's help," he objected. "That may be true," said Reason gravely, "but you had the courage to try, and what you can do is often simply a matter of what you will do." That's why, said Azaz, there was one very important thing about your quest that we couldn't discuss until you returned. I remember, said Milo eagerly. Tell me now. It was impossible, said the king, looking at the mathematician. Completely impossible, said the mathematician, looking at the king. Do you mean, stammered the bug, who suddenly felt a bit faint. Yes, indeed, they repeated together, but if we'd told you then, you might not have gone. And as you've discovered, so many things are possible just as long as you don't know they're impossible. And for the remainder of the ride, Milo didn't utter a sound. Finally, when they reached a broad, flat plain midway between Dictionopolis and Digitopolis, somewhat to the right of the Valley of Sound and a little to the left of the Forest of Sight, the long line of carriages and horsemen stopped, and the great carnival began. Gaily striped tents and pavilions sprang up everywhere as the workmen scurried about like ants. Within minutes there were race courses and grandstands, sideshows and refreshment booths, gaming fields, Ferris wheels, banners, bunting, and bedlam, almost without pause. The mathematician provided a continuous display of brilliant fireworks, made up of exploding numbers which multiplied and divided with breathtaking results. The colors, of course, being supplied by Chroma, and the noise by a deliriously happy Dr. Discord. Thanks to the soundkeeper, there was music and laughter, and for very brief moments, even a little silence. Alec Bing set up an enormous telescope and invited everyone to see the other side of the moon. And the humbug wandered through the crowd, accepting congratulations and recounting in great detail his brave exploits, much of which gained immeasurably in the telling. And each evening, just at sunset, a royal banquet was held. There was everything imaginable to eat. King Azaz had ordered a special supply of delicious words in all flavors, and for those who liked exotic foods, in all languages too. The mathematician had provided innumerable platters of division dumplings, which Milo was very careful to avoid, for no matter how many you ate, when you finished there was more on your plate than when you began. And of course, following the meal came songs, epic poems, and speeches in praise of the princesses and the 3 gallant adventurers who had rescued them. King Azaz and the mathematician pledged that every year at this time they would lead their armies to the mountains of ignorance until not one demon remained, and everyone agreed that no finer carnival for no finer reason had ever been held in Wisdom. But even things as fine as all that must end sometime. And late on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the tents were struck, the pavilions were folded, and everything was packed ready to leave. It's time to go now, said Reason, for there is much to do. And as she spoke, Milo suddenly remembered his home. He wanted very much to go back, yet somehow he could not bear the thought of leaving. And so you must say goodbye, said Ryan, patting him gently on the cheek. To everyone? Said Milo unhappily. He looked around slowly at all the friends he'd made, and he looked very hard so as not to forget any of them for even an instant. But mostly he looked at Talk and the humbug, with whom he had shared so much, the perils, the dangers, the fears, and best of all, the victory. Never had anyone had 2 more steadfast companions. Can't you both come with me? He asked, knowing the answer as he said it. I'm afraid not, old man, replied the bug. I'd like to, but I've arranged a lecture tour which will keep me occupied for years. And they do need a watchdog here, barked Talk sadly. Milo embraced the bug, who in his most typical fashion was heard to mumble gruffly, bah, but whose damp eyes told quite a different story. Then the boy threw his arms around Talk's neck and for just a moment held on very tightly. Thank you for everything you've taught me, said Milo to everybody as a tear rolled down his cheek. And thank you for what you've taught us, said the king, and as he clapped his hands, the little car was brought forward, polished like new. Here's another picture. The princesses and Talk and Humbug and Milo all having to say goodbye. It's the end of their journey. Milo got in, and with one last look started down the road with everyone waving him on. "Goodbye," he shouted. "Goodbye, I'll be back." "Goodbye," shouted his Oz. "Always remember the importance of words." "And numbers," added the math magician forcefully. "Surely you don't think numbers are as important as words," he heard his Oz shout from the distance. "Is that so?" replied the math magician a little more faintly. "Why, Oh dear," thought Milo, "I do hope they don't start it all again." And in a moment they had faded from sight as the road dipped, turned, and headed for home. Chapter 20. Goodbye and Hello. As the pleasant countryside flashed by and the wind whistled a tune on the windshield, it suddenly occurred to Milo that he must have been gone for several weeks. "I do hope that no one's been worried," he thought, urging the car on faster. "I've never been away this long before." The late afternoon sun had turned now from a vivid yellow to a warm, lazy orange, and it seemed almost as tired as he was. The road raced ahead in a series of gentle curves that began to look familiar, and off in the distance the solitary toll booth appeared. A welcome sight indeed. In a few moments he reached the end of his journey, deposited his coin, and drove through. And almost before realizing it, he was sitting in the middle of his own room again. "It's only 6 o'clock, he observed with a yawn. "Ooh." And then in a moment he made an even more interesting discovery. "And it's still today! I've been gone for only an hour!" he cried in amazement, for he'd certainly never realized how much he could do in so short a time. Milo was much too tired to talk and almost too tired for dinner, so without a murmur he went off to bed as soon as he could. He pulled the covers around him, took a last look at his room, which somehow seemed very different than he'd remembered, and then drifted into a deep and welcome sleep. School went very quickly the next day, but not quickly enough, for Milo's head was full of plans and his eyes could see nothing but the toll booth and what lay beyond. He waited impatiently for the end of class, and when the time finally came, his feet raced his thoughts all the way back to the house. Another trip, I'll leave right away. They'll all be so glad to see me and all." He stopped abruptly at the door of his room, for where the toll booth had been just the night before, there was now nothing at all. He searched frantically throughout the apartment, but it had vanished just as mysteriously as it had come. And in its place was another bright blue envelope, which was addressed simply, "For Milo, who now knows the way." He opened it quickly and read, "Dear Milo, you have now completed your trip, courtesy of the Phantom Toll Booth. We trust that everything has been satisfactory, and I hope you understand why we had to come and collect it. You see, there are so many other boys and girls waiting to use it too. It's true that there are many lands you've still to visit, some of which are not even on the map, and wonderful things to see that no one has yet imagined, but we're quite sure that if you really wanted to, you'll find a way to reach them all by yourself. Yours truly." The signature was blurred and couldn't be read. Milo walked sadly to the window and squeezed himself into one corner of the large armchair. He felt very lonely and desolate as his thoughts turned far away, to the foolish, lovable Bug, to the comforting assurance of Tuck standing next to him, to the erratic, excitable Din, to little Alec, who he hoped would someday reach the ground, to Rhyme and Reason, without whom wisdom withered, and to the many, many others he would remember always. And yet, even as he thought of all these things, he noticed somehow that the sky was a lovely shade of blue, and that one cloud had the shape of a sailing ship. The tips of the trees held pale young buds, and the leaves were a rich, deep green. Outside the window there was so much to see and hear and touch. Walks to take, hills to climb, caterpillars to watch as they strolled through the garden. There were voices to hear and conversations to listen to and wonder, and the special smell of each day. And in the very room in which he sat, there were books that could take you anywhere, and things to invent and make and build and break, and all the puzzle and excitement of everything he didn't know. music to play, songs to sing, and worlds to imagine, and then someday make real. His thoughts darted eagerly about as everything looked new and worth trying. Well, I would like to make another trip, he said, jumping to his feet, but I really don't know when I'll have the time. There's just so much to do right here. And that is the end of our book. So you remember at the beginning, Milo thought he was very bored because he couldn't think of anything to do, and he wasn't using his imagination very well. But throughout the book, he learned how to use his creativity and went on a wild and crazy journey and met really crazy characters. And in the end, he learned that sometimes your imagination is all you need to achieve your dreams. So I really like this book. It's one of my favorites. So I wonder what we'll choose for next time. I don't know. I guess you'll have to tune in. So we'll see you next time, next Monday at 6:30 for another Page Turners. Have a good night.